was hauling heavy equipment along Highway 6 in Nevada, a long, empty stretch with nothing but sand and scrub in every direction. It was around midnight, and I had a few more hours before the next rest stop. That route is pretty barren, and I didn't expect to see anyone for miles. Then, out of nowhere, I spotted a dim glow in the distance, low to the ground and too faint to be headlights. As I got closer, I realized it was a campfire. Now, campfires in the middle of nowhere at night, they're usually nothing. But as I passed, I saw something that made me pull over. A pickup truck, badly dented, its doors wide open. Camping in a desert's not unusual, but this setup looked more like someone had been in a rush. There were bags strewn around, clothes spilled out, and a lantern half buried in the sand, still flickering. I pulled my truck over and got out, leaving the lights on to scan the area. The fire was still burning low, but I didn't see anyone nearby. I called out, half expecting someone to yell back, maybe someone stranded who needed a jump or gas. Nothing. Just the crackling fire and the hum of my truck's engine in the distance. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked around the truck. The cabin was a mess. Fast food wrappers, receipts, and, strangely, a half-done crossword puzzle lying on the seat with the pen beside it. I felt a shiver creep up my spine. The whole setup looked like someone had just been here, but there was no sign of where they'd gone or why they'd leave like this. I decided I'd seen enough and headed back to my rig, figuring I'd call it in to the nearest sheriff's station. But just as I turned to leave, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps coming from somewhere behind me. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen or heard a soul, and yet there it was, distinct against the quiet of the desert. I whipped around, scanning the darkness, but I didn't see anyone. I called out again, more forcefully this time, but all I got back was silence. My instincts were screaming at me to get back to the truck. So I picked up the pace, but as I reached for the door, I heard a voice, low and rough. Looking for something? I spun around to see a man standing there, maybe 40 yards away. His face was barely visible under the glow from my headlights, but I could see he was watching me closely. He was tall, wearing a ragged-looking flannel and jeans that were caked in dirt. He had a shovel slung over one shoulder and was holding something in his other hand, a duffel bag, heavy and sagging. I stammered out something about checking if he needed help, but he just stared, not moving. I remember his eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed right on mine. After a long pause, he tilted his head and asked, "You mind putting that fire out for me?" I didn't know what to say. I wasn't about to get any closer to him, and something about the way he asked didn't sit right. Before I could respond, he dropped the bag onto the ground with a heavy thud and took a step forward, his hand tightening around the shovel. At that point, my fear kicked in. I backed up, making my way to my truck's door without breaking eye contact. He watched every step, his face expressionless, almost like he was sizing me up. When I got to my door, he stopped and smiled. A cold, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Take it easy," he said softly. "Just taking care of some business." I didn't wait to hear more. I jumped into my truck, locked the doors, and sped off down the highway, not even glancing back to see if he was following. My heart was racing the whole way, and even after a half hour of driving, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, watching me with that empty smile. I reported the abandoned truck and campfire at the next station I reached, but when they called back a week later, the officer told me they'd found no truck, no fire, and no sign that anyone had been there at all, just endless sand and empty desert. Since then, every time I drive a stretch that empty, I keep my doors locked and my eyes sharp. I don't stop for anything I don't have to. My name's Kevin, and I've been a trucker for the better part of 15 years. 4 years ago, I took a job hauling freight from North Dakota to Montana. I'd been pushing hard through the night, trying to reach my destination before dawn. I was exhausted, but didn't want to stop, so I took a deep breath of smelling salts to keep me going for the last stretch. My route was isolated, with just the forest on either side, and as I drove, the road stretched ahead of me, silent and empty. I'd been driving in that eerie quiet for over an hour when something strange appeared in my headlights. A purple dress lying in the middle of the road. I slowed down, squinting in disbelief. Was I imagining things? The fabric was spread out, almost neatly, right in the center of my lane. Confused and a little unnerved, I drove past, my eyes fixed on it in the rearview mirror. A couple 100 yards ahead, I spotted another piece of clothing, a pair of small red shoes. This time, I stopped. My skin prickled with a deep sense of unease, and I clutched the old cross my dad had left me, muttering a quick prayer. Just up the road, scattered along the asphalt, were more items: a child's shirt, a pair of shorts, some socks. I got out of the truck and cautiously walked over to inspect the pile of clothing. It looked like it belonged to kids. My heart was pounding as I glanced into the woods, half expecting someone or something to jump out. The dark, silent trees seemed to press in closer, making me feel exposed. Suddenly, from the left side of the road, I heard a crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I whipped around, scanning the darkness, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't see anything, but then another crunch echoed from the opposite side. At that point, my instinct took over, and I sprinted back to the truck, slamming the door behind me. But before I could start the engine, I heard something that froze my blood. A child's scream, high-pitched and desperate, coming from somewhere in the woods. I sat there, heart pounding, torn between the urge to help and the gut feeling that this was a setup. Then, another scream, this time closer. My mind raced, imagining the worst. I threw the truck into gear and turned it to point my headlights into the woods. The beams lit up a narrow stretch between the trees, and for just a moment, I saw them. 3 figures crouched low, barely visible, one of them holding a massive speaker. They ducked behind the trees as soon as the lights hit them, but I'd seen enough. I grabbed my phone to call the police, my hands shaking as I punched in the numbers. As I waited, I heard a loud thunk against the side of my truck, like someone had thrown a rock. Panic flooded my veins. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement on the passenger side. A shadowy figure throwing something that cracked my window. That was it. I dropped my phone, slammed on the gas, and sped down the road as fast as I could, my hands locked in a death grip on the wheel. As I drove, I caught a glimpse in my side mirror. A man standing by the roadside, watching me disappear. I couldn't make out his face, but he yelled something, his voice angry and distorted by the roar of my engine. I didn't stop until I was well into the next town. I called the police again, explained what had happened, and gave them the exact location of the clothing and the people I'd seen in the woods. They assured me they'd check it out, but I never heard back. To this day, I don't know what those people were planning. Were they trying to lure me out to rob me? Attack me? I'll never know, and honestly, I don't want to. All I know is that I'll never stop along an empty stretch of highway again, no matter what I see. I'm Ray, and I've been on the road long enough to know what it's like to get spooked at night. But this was different. This happened just a few months back on a late-night haul from Texas to Arizona. It was around midnight, and I was in the middle of a long, empty stretch of road, the kind that's straight as an arrow and cuts through endless desert with no signs of life. Nothing but the hum of my engine and the occasional crackle on the radio. I was tired but pushing through, hoping to make it to a truck stop a few hours out. Then, out of nowhere, my radio crackled, and a voice came through. "Anybody got their ears on?" The voice was quiet, almost shaky. I figured it was another trucker, so I grabbed the receiver and answered back. "Yeah, I got you. You alright?" There was a pause, then the voice came through again. "You seen that car pulled over back there? Looks abandoned. I hadn't seen any cars, but I hadn't been looking for one either. I figured it was just a trucker making small talk, trying to stay awake. Nah, didn't see anything. Where'd you spot it? He didn't answer right away. After a few moments of static, he came back. A couple miles back. Looked like it broke down. Hazards on, door wide open. Now that got my attention. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. I asked him if he'd stop to check it out, but all I got was more static. Then he came back on, sounding more rattled than before. Yeah, I stopped, but there was no one inside. Just an empty car with the door open. I was about to respond when he cut me off. Hold up. I think someone's standing on the shoulder up ahead. I leaned forward, gripping the wheel, eyes scanning the road, but all I saw was darkness. I didn't see any other headlights or signs of anyone else around. I grabbed the receiver again. Hey, where are you? I don't see anyone. For a few seconds, there was nothing. I could hear his breathing, heavy and uneven like he was nervous. Then he whispered, "He's just standing there, right in the middle of the road." I started to feel a tightness in my chest. There was no one in front of me. Nothing but blacktop stretching into the darkness. "Where exactly are you?" I asked, feeling my own nerves creeping up. He didn't answer, just static. Then, all of a sudden, the silence was broken by the sound of screeching brakes and a loud thud, like someone had slammed on their brakes and hit something hard. I nearly jumped out of my seat. "Hey!" I shouted into the receiver. "What happened? Are you all right?" Static filled the line for what felt like forever, and then finally his voice came through, shaky and barely audible. "He's gone. Just gone." I didn't know what to make of it, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I drove on, my eyes glued to the road, expecting to see something, anything, that might explain what he'd been talking about. But there was nothing. Just mile after mile of empty road. About 20 minutes later, the radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't him. It was another trucker asking if anyone was out there. I answered, glad to hear someone else, and mentioned what had just happened. He paused, then asked, "You on Route 380? "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He sighed, like he'd heard this story before. "You're not the first one to hear that voice. It's happened to a few of us over the years. Someone calling out about a broken down car, seeing people standing in the road. But every time, there's no one there." My blood ran cold as I listened. And the trucker? Never found. Some think it's just a prank, but I've heard that voice myself. Same story, just be careful out here. I hung up and kept my eyes glued to the road for the rest of the drive, not daring to look at my mirrors or pull over for anything. Whatever it was, I didn't want any part of it. Since that night, I've steered clear of that route as much as I can.